Thanks, Freya. Yeah, I did give us a little buffer time so people can slowly join, grab a cup of tea, whatever it is they need to do. But I will just start by letting you know what we're going to cover in today's quite short session. So I'll kind of give you a little introduction into who Unseen is in case you haven't encountered us before. I know there's a few familiar names today. And then we'll have a look just kind of understanding the scale of modern slavery and giving you some useful insights that have come through from our helpline in the last year. We'll then have a kind of brief look at, although we're talking a lot about supply chain risk, about the other areas of your business that can be impacted by modern slavery, and we'll specifically look at touch points for the finance sector. And then in the hopes not to leave it on too heavy a note, we'll have a talk about very briefly about what can you do, what are the next steps, and then yeah, we'll have a Q&A with Unseen's finance lead, Freya. Great, we'll get started. So in case you aren't familiar with us, Unseen is a UK charity, and our overall vision is to have a world without slavery. It's very ambitious. We hope one day to not exist, and we kind of aim to transform society's response so that we can all live in a world that is free from abuse and exploitation. And that we have three kind of pillars that we use to do that. So the first one is supporting and empowering survivors, and that's through our outreach support. We run safe houses, and then we also run the UK's only independent modern slavery and exploitation helpline. Our middle column is policy and research. So we aim to influence systemic change through policy and research, which includes external research projects, partner work. We work with universities, and we're also really lucky to have a survivor consultancy group as well. And then the final pillar is the business services team, and that's where Freya and I sit. And we aim to equip stakeholders through training and consultancy services, specifically to businesses, but also to public bodies, charities, any organisation that needs support, like a session like today, for example. So I mentioned it briefly, but it is really useful just to explain what the Modern Slavery and Exploitation Helpline is. To give you a bit of insight, it was established in 2016, and it remains the UK's only dedicated helpline to modern slavery. And since its launch, our advisors have had over 60,000 contacts. It's open 365 days a year, and it's free to call for anyone in the UK. And we're very lucky. It's managed by a highly trained team of advisors, and they have access to interpreters in over 200 languages. As you can imagine, people who've experienced exploitation haven't had a lot of choice in their lives. So our aim is to make the helpline as accessible as possible and to give as many choices as possible to someone that might be accessing it. So it can be contacted through the phone number that you can see on screen, but also through an online web form for people that don't want to or don't feel comfortable to talk on the phone, and also via email or through our app. So if you scan that QR code there, it'll take you to download our app. Beyond being a really vital tool for people who may be experiencing exploitation, professionals who need advice, people who have seen things and they're not sure how to report or what to do, it's also really vital for recording data about real modern slavery cases. In this session, we are going to have a look at both Home Office data and Unseen's data, but what we can do through the helpline is often get a much broader and a much more in-depth look at what's happening in the UK right now. So as I said, leading us very nicely onto modern slavery and statistics. I think it's really useful for us to understand scale and the trends that we're seeing at the moment, because that will inevitably inform the things that your businesses will see and also the approach you need to take to managing that risk. So in February of this year, the Home Office released their 2025 statistics on modern slavery in the UK. So all of their statistics relate to the people who have been referred into the National Referral Mechanism, and that is the UK's method for formally recognising and addressing people who have experienced exploitation. We won't go too much into the weeds of what that means and what that looks like today. But what we do know is that they have seen year-on-year increases in the number of people being referred into the NRM. So in 2025, that's 23,411 potential victims of modern slavery were referred, and that is the highest in any year since the NRM began, exceeding the most recent highest, which was 2024. Predominantly, people were referred to for labour exploitation, that accounting for 36% of referrals. And I think it's interesting to note that the most common nationalities referred in 2025 were the highest being the UK, and then followed by Eritrea, and then people from Vietnam. It's really difficult to give a concrete reason as to why these numbers continue to increase year on year. We don't know if it's because there's more exploitation, or if that with improved awareness raising, what we're seeing is that more people have a knowledge of the topic, they're aware of what might be happening to them, and so more victims are being successfully identified where they might not have been before. Or it could be that the numbers are just increasing. What we do know, and we feel really confident in, is that there are still tens of thousands of victims who are not being identified through this process. So although that number is big, we still think it's a relatively small proportion of what's happening in the UK. So unsurprisingly, those trends are reflected in what the helpline's seeing. So if you click that little orange half box there, you can it will take you to the helpline annual assessment, which is released every year. Our data team works really hard to crunch all the numbers of the people that have come through the various methods of the helpline to give us a better insight into what they've experienced in the last year. So in 2025, the helpline received 7,035 calls and 4,196 web forms of app submissions, which related to 2,954 modern slavery cases. So you can see here that 6,628 potential victims were identified through those cases, which suggests to us probably that where there are cases, there are multiple victims identified, and 81% of the cases reported to the helpline took place in the UK, where the country was known. And then of that 6,628, 56% involved labour exploitation. And it's important to note that labour exploitation is any work or service which people are forced to do against their will or under threat of some form of punishment. So those are really generalised statistics about what we see across the UK, but how does this impact the finance sector? In 2025, financial control was frequently indicated, presenting as debt bondage, wage deductions, financial penalties, and withheld pay. So what we know is that money really drives modern slavery. According to the International Labour Organization, each year forced labour in the private economy generates $236 billion in illegal profits for its perpetrators, which is a staggering 37% increase since 2014. So what we know for sure is that modern slavery is so profitable because it is a low risk, high gain crime where money is used to both control victims and to line the pockets of criminals. The reason modern slavery is so profitable is because unlike drugs or armaments, where you have an A and B transaction and then that's the end, people, when they've been commodified, can be sold and exploited in a cycle of gain and exploitation that can be profitable long term. 2,471 cases reported to the helpline involved financial control, and that makes up 44% of the cases reported to the helpline where the control method was known. So we know that control of finances, forced debt, illegally removing wages, having to pay for things like holiday or sick pay or PPE, all these different things are at the core of financial control and therefore labour exploitation. So that is one of the ways that the financial sector is implicated through modern slavery. But why should we care? Why is this impacting your business specifically? So often when we talk about risk, we're really talking about the supply chain, but there are lots of different reasons that modern slavery is a risk to your business. The first and probably most obvious is reputation, and we will look at a case study slightly later on that kind of really highlights that. But businesses do have a moral obligation to protect their workers. When we talk about risk, we really are talking about risk to workers in addition to risk to business. And failing to do so can cause significant reputational damage. But there's also a really positive reputation and brand building that businesses can develop when they act ethically, which can help to attract customers and future talent. And with the conversations that we're having at the moment about things like fast fashion and ethical consumption, that is moving more and more to all different sectors. The next would be financial. There can be significant financial implications for businesses that are found to have modern slavery in their supply chains and haven't had the correct due diligence to tackle this. And we will have a look at proposed updates in legislation that will potentially bring that into a much more concrete reality for UK businesses. But a quick example would be the fashion chain Boohoo. They were identified to have modern slavery within their supply chain in 2020. It hit all the papers, everyone was talking about it, and they was a risk that they were facing significant financial repercussions. New Zealand is another country that have brought in penalties for businesses that are shown to not be compliant with modern slavery legislation. The next would be regulatory. So modern slavery is a crime that is related heavily to money laundering. So any financial institution holding proceeds of modern slavery or human trafficking could be liable for modern slavery offences. And again, we're going to have a look at how updates to the Crime and Policing Act can impact that, which takes us on to criminal. So again, we will look at this in more detail, but there is a significant risk that any businesses that are not seen to do appropriate due diligence could be at risk of criminal consequences. And again, there is a legal obligation that many businesses should be tackling modern slavery. We'll talk about the statutory guidance through the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, but we all talk about reporting, modern slavery statements. There is a requirement that businesses are doing due diligence to ensure that they are effectively addressing their specific business risks. So, key areas to focus on for the financial industry, as we said, supply chain due diligence. This is what we all think of. We're seeing cases in modern slavery in every sector, within a business's own operations and within their supply chains. And all of these sectors will have some link to the financial industry. Some sectors in your supply chain might be considered more high risk than others, and it's important that you have an oversight of where your specific supply chain is at risk. So that could be if you have a lot of construction suppliers, if you have a high concentration of engagement with logistics or manufacturing, we know that they are significantly higher risk. That's partly because they have long and complex supply chains, but also because they have a reliance on temporary and agency workers, also because of a higher rate of subcontracting, which can in turn cause reduced visibility, and it can make it easier for exploitation to go unnoticed. The other is location, so something like construction happening in the UK in a rural area where you have less just obvious visibility. If it's happening, manufacturing that's happening abroad, so you don't have boots on the ground access to seeing what conditions the workers are in. Again, the nature of the workforce. So if it's low barrier to entry, those have a high proportion of workers that could be exploited, including migrant workers. They're at higher risk. And there are just known, so construction, manufacturing are sectors that are known to have higher risk labour practices. The next would be research, would be modern slavery as a financial crime. So research by FEMIS, International Services. I don't think I've said that right. I've never actually said it out loud before. I've always just seen it written down. The UK Independence Anti-Slavery Commissioner and the Tribe Freedom Foundation indicated that many financial institutions are dealing with modern slavery and human trafficking as a separate concern outside of their kind of anti-money laundering and financial crime team frameworks, but actually they can't be completely separated. They are always intermingling. And then the next would be customer and frontline due diligence. So if, for example, if you were a bank with branches, you have staff that interact directly with customers. If you are an insurance organisation that has call centres, you have workers who are engaging directly with your customers. Those people need to be trained to identify red flags for modern slavery, including those that might present in interactions with victims, but also exploiters as well. Investments in asset management are also important. A lot of focus is on supply chain, but value chain is just as important. And wealth management and investment services for kind of ultra high net worth individuals or companies often include large portfolios, private equity, direct investments, which could indirectly involve companies or industries, to industries linked to modern slavery practices. And investors and lenders have a significant influence and leverage, therefore, to tackle modern slavery and human trafficking risks within those organisations. The fifth one is supporting survivors. Financial institutions can help to combat modern slavery by supporting survivors seeking access to financial services. So for someone being exploited, financial services can be a key step into reintegrating into society. So for example, if you've had your passport stolen, it's really difficult to set up a bank account. There's a lot of barriers that relate directly to the financial services industry that are faced by survivors. And there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration to ensure that they have access to the things they need to recover and start again. And then the sixth would be being aware of the due diligence you need to do within your own operations. So be aware of outsourced services. Many firms rely on outsourced services for things like facilities management, cleaning, security, catering, if you run events. And those industries, for the same reasons that your supply chain businesses might be higher risk, those are also higher risk, but you have an even more direct link. So as promised, I'm going to take a relatively brief look at some legislation that will be relevant to you. So the TIS guidance, the Transparency in Supply Chains guidance, was released on the 25th of March in 2025 as a supplementary guide to compliance with Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act, which many of you will be familiar is the piece of legislation that requires businesses to release a modern slavery statement every financial year. And it went into a lot of depth about, or it went into more depth, a lot might be generous, on how to align with the Modern Slavery Act, with an emphasis on detailed reporting, alignment with international frameworks, and a significant focus on continuous improvement. It split the Modern Slavery Act into two levels. So level 1 and level 2 disclosures, with level 1 being for organisations who have sort of just begun to publish modern slavery statements. And then level 2 is for organisations that have published multiple statements, and we expect to be having a more mature approach. It's split up into 6 sections, looking at your organisation and the structure of your business, including your governance frameworks, and the knowledge you have in your supply chains, also your organisational policies and how they address modern slavery. It requires reporting relating to how you assess the risk within your organisation, your supply chain and your value chain, and then the actions that you take to manage that risk. And then the due diligence activities that you take to prevent and then address any high-risk activities or instances of modern slavery, or how you would approach your grievance, your escalation and grievance mechanisms. The other point is training, how you incorporate modern slavery into standardised training, awareness campaigns, and how you would engage with external bodies to ensure that that is tailored to the high-risk teams. And then monitoring and evaluations. This is making sure that you have effective KPIs that map modern slavery and human rights risks, and then allows you to map your statement each year on the commitments that you've made in your previous statement. So making sure it's continuously building and you're able to show that continuous improvement. So similarly, the CCLA benchmark is a public report that ranks the disclosures published in the modern slavery statements of the UK 100 top listed companies. And it incorporates most of level 1 of the TIS guidance and then some of the level 2 points where it already aligns with the existing framework. And that has an emphasis on splitting your approach into 3 points, which is find it, fix it, and prevent it. And then what it does is it publicly ranks all of those businesses into 5 tiers, from unsatisfactory to leading. I think there's about 58 questions within their methodology, and there is between 10 and 30 points available for each question. So it's very detailed and very extensive evaluation. Both of these pieces of guidance have an emphasis on the value chain. Financial services do have an advantage over other sectors when it comes to value chain, because there is so much more control over products and where they go compared to other industries, especially when you're looking at things like investments as your point of focus when discussing value chain. So I hinted at it briefly before, but there have been a few changes in the last few months that I think it's useful for you to be aware of. So the firstly is there have been proposed changes to the Immigration Asylum Bill. They aren't fully confirmed at this point, but they were mentioned in the King's speech back in May 2026. And it poses a lot of changes to the UK's immigration and asylum system. But most notably for businesses, it would propose significant changes to the ways that you were expected to report on modern slavery. So one example is that the bill introduces mandatory reporting areas. So if a business has not reported on one of them, it has to provide an explanation as to why. It's just not that you can just not have that in your statement. There has to be an acknowledgement that you have not met that reporting standard. It would also introduce financial penalties for non-compliance. And so that's 1 million or 1% of turnover, whichever is higher. So as I mentioned before, when we're talking about risks, the risk landscape is kind of in a flux right now because yes, there are some financial risks that you could face, but if these changes are put into law, then there is a really significant financial risk for non-compliance. And it would give the Modern Slavery Act more teeth to be properly complied with. And it would also extend reporting expectations to public bodies, so it wouldn't just be private organisations. So in a similar but not exactly the same vein, the Crime and Policing Act 2026 has one section of it that came into force first at the end of June 2026, and that's section 50. And this has significant impact because, like the proposed changes to the Immigration Asylum Bill, there is a financial, or there is a criminal compliance element. So this act significantly expands corporate liability. So businesses can no longer be held liable for only a selection of economic offences, but instead it expands corporate liability to any crime committed by a senior manager. And to support that, what is defined as a senior manager is no longer associated with what a job title is, but there would be an explanation of what the role is. So even if someone doesn't have the job title senior manager, but they do responsibilities day to day that reflect that of a senior manager, they would fall under the legislation. So that's been expanded. And another change within the Act is that having adequate procedures can no longer be used as a defence. So that means that due diligence processes alone will not automatically shield an organisation from prosecution. So I think that's a really interesting change in the landscape that's happening. It's interesting to see them happen at the same time. So I said we'd give you a case study. So although this isn't a financial services organisation, I think it's very, very interesting because in February 2026, Dyson settled a landmark legal claim, which was brought by 24 migrant workers from its Malaysian supplier, 88 Industrial. It's important to know that Dyson did not admit liability, but the workers alleged that they experienced forced labour, including having their passports confiscated, experiencing debt bondage, so where they were forced to work to pay off debts that they couldn't get out from under, and then they experienced physical abuse as well. And the three critical takeaways we take from the outcomes of this case is that jurisdiction is no longer a shield. The UK Supreme Court ruled that the case could be heard in England, not Malaysia, and found that because Dyson's sustainability policies and oversight were managed from the UK, the failure of care had happened in the UK rather than in Malaysia, which is why it was able to be brought to the UK courts. The second point is that the level of control that an organisation requires of its supplier can equal liability. So the claimants argued that Dyson's high level of control over the supplier's production meant that Dyson owed the workers a direct duty of care because they were dictating how the supplier operates, which meant that they were liable for their labour practices. So we need to be thinking about when we're managing high-risk suppliers, what requirements are we putting on them, how tightly are we controlling their operations, and therefore how they have to act in order to meet our requirements is a direct impact on us and our business. And then the other thing is looking beyond audit. So the site in question had clean audit reports. So the court looked past the clean audit reports to internal emails, supporting documents, to decide if Dyson should have or could have known about the abuse and the issues taking place on the site. So they didn't just leave it as, oh, well, we tried. They were like, they looked, make sure to extend beyond the formalized report to see if there was informal and maybe more hidden communication that should have indicated that there was risky practices happening. And the kind of bottom line of this case is that financial and reputational risk now extends deep into our supply chain and financing portfolios. It's not just within our own operations and within the UK alone. And that significantly broadens our scope for where we think our risk sits. Very interesting case. I recommend reading it if you want to learn more. So, as I said, I'd leave us on a slightly more hopeful note before handing over to Freya. It is obviously a really heavy topic. The thought that we have modern slavery and exploitation in our operations, value chain, supply chain isn't nice. If you're just someone that cares about other workers, then it's not a nice thought to think that your business could be engaged in that. So there are things that you can do to ensure that you've got due diligence practices in place internally. You can make sure you've got a human rights working group. And then there are organisations like Unseen who can work with your business to develop strategy and support with compliance, work with targeted training, risk assessments, all these different things to make sure that you can feel more confident in the approach that you're taking. So that feels less negative than than look at all these terrible things that are happening. So on that positive note, that was a whistle-stop tour. But I am going to hand over for the last 15 minutes to Freya, and I'm also going to pop a QR code on the screen as well, which you can scan to sign up to the newsletter. There is some interesting content that's coming out that might be useful specifically for this audience. Over to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Izzy. I think having this webinar at this time is really important. I think what you've highlighted really well is that we're kind of going through a bit of a period of change, and there's lots of rumblings going on, some things passing through, some things in the works that are really kind of shaping the way that we approach modern slavery as financial institutions. I realised I didn't introduce myself earlier. My bad. I am Freya Smith. I'm a lead business consultant with Unseen, and my specialty area is financial services. So I work predominantly with a lot of the financial services organisations that we partner with here at Unseen. I also lead our finance hub as well, which is a quarterly meeting where all partners come and we discuss shared challenges, shared topics, and kind of produce some tangible outcomes as well. This time at the end of this session is really to get into any questions, queries, comments, feedback that anybody might have. Like I mentioned earlier, your cameras and your mics are off, unfortunately, but you are able to pop any questions that you might have into the chat. As Izzy also mentioned, we do have a newsletter. So outside of the hubs and the businesses that we work with, you are still able to sign up to our newsletter regardless of your relationship with us. Within that, we kind of try to do a sort of update on a regular basis around a lot of those things that Izzy's just spoken about. So it's a really good way to stay in the loop, even if you're not working with us directly. I've also popped at the bottom of the screen, although I appreciate it's a little bit small, my email address again. So like I say, if you think of anything that might pop up post this call, you're very welcome to reach out and ask questions after the fact. I can't see any questions in the Q&A at the moment. I'll give it another minute. But
in the meantime, I'll say I've got a question for you.
Oh, go for it.
Which I didn't tell you in advance.
Okay.
Since you're our finance lead and you run the finance hub, I was wondering if there's anything interesting happening within financial services that you would like to spotlight. If there's any interesting activities or approaches or strategies being developed that you are particularly excited about.
Yeah, that is a great question.
Thank you.
I think that at the moment, a lot of the organisations that we're working with at the moment have already gone through the processes of strengthening a lot of their supply chain due diligence. So we're at the point now where organisations are looking at things like third-party audits or visits to high-risk suppliers. How have they identified those high-risk suppliers? Have they done specific human rights, modern slavery risk assessments outside of EcoVadis? And are they doing anything off the back of those risk assessments? So feel quite lucky in that piece we've worked through. Where I see a lot of the focus right now is looking at that downstream value chain piece. So how do we conduct effective due diligence for the financial services that we provide? And how do we make sure that that's just as robust as the work that's already in place with the supply chain? Another thing that I have been working on a lot is in response to some FCA regulation, which I'm hoping you're all aware of, but the material third party sort of regulation that came into force, or is coming into force actually, at the beginning of next year. There's been a lot of shift around how organisations are identifying material suppliers, and also what are they doing to sort of manage that risk and engage them going forward, as well as also identifying material fourth parties. I know that's a very oversimplification of this. I know we have someone from the FCA on the call, so they're probably telling me it's it's all wrong. But in relation to that, what I've seen happen is a lot of businesses trying to build in risk identification and mapping as part of their business as usual processes, and how are they applying a modern slavery lens to that. So I've been doing a lot of work with a lot of people on that over the last few months, which has been really exciting to see, and it's nice to kind of see that shift towards business as usual process as well. I can see that someone has put a question in the chat, so thank you very much. The question says, understanding that the focus of this discussion is on the UK, but what is Unseen's view of the recent Australian approach to introduce a specific criminal offence for the failure to prevent modern slavery? Great question. I think that actually we're seeing a lot of shift towards this idea of having more criminal liability for organisations who have failed to prevent modern slavery. I'm not super up to date on how the specifics of any case law for that would work, but we're seeing it kind of with how we're moving towards that within the Crime and Policing Act in the UK. There's also another bill which is making slower progress, so we haven't focused on it today, around mandatory human rights due diligence. And obviously in Europe as well, we've seen a lot of legislation coming out around actually enforcing due diligence standards. And I think all of that is a shift in a positive direction. Anything that motivates an organisation to be putting in robust procedures in place is going to be a positive thing. I think also referring back to that Dyson case, what the court system was looking at there is what I can imagine is probably quite similar to your question, is actually, is there a possibility that Dyson knew about this and didn't act and weren't proactive in resolving or preventing the problem? So whilst this is a kind of a thing that's happening in Australia, it's also something that's happening here, but maybe not in the same mandated way right now. Next question. Someone has popped in the chat. As an investor, what questions could we ask the investee portfolio companies to understand how they are approaching modern slavery beyond their modern slavery policies? Great question again. So the big shift at the moment is going from that idea of tell me what you've got to show me what you've got and how does it work. Asking an organisation if they have signed your code of conduct or if they have a modern slavery policy is a first step, but it doesn't mean anything if there's no sort of quality assurance that's going beyond that to check the quality, check compliance, and also check the standards of the work that they're putting in place. When it comes to specific questions that you could be looking at, I would be really tailoring it around that practical action. So, how are they equipped to be responding to modern slavery cases? What does that process look like? Have they have evidence of having to do that in the past? What does their supplier due diligence look like when it comes to assessing risk? Do they have a formalized process for doing that? And if they do, what's it based on? How did they formulate it? It's really kind of those core questions, but actually seeking a layer below. I know that when I have sort of spoken about this and suggested this to organisations that we work with, the immediate pushback is, oh, well, we're not modern slavery experts, so I don't know what I'm looking for. But I think actually being able to, again, build that into your business as usual processes, having a kind of core set of standards that you're looking for with anything that flags, being able to have the opportunity to do deeper research, ask more questions and follow up on. So kind of have your set standard to begin with, which are questions that you can ask that would potentially highlight any concerns or red flags that you can train your teams up on as kind of your first step, with an acknowledgement that if anything is flagged, that will require that ongoing management and maybe a little bit more training or support or advice in the long term. The same goes for suppliers as well. Obviously, you may have a more well-established relationship with suppliers. It really depends on how you kind of manage your own portfolios and investments and the sort of involvement leverage stake that you hold with them. But the principle is the same. It's also something that we've been looking at mostly from the supply side right now, but like I say, we're kind of moving towards that downstream value chain of how do we build out assurance processes and test plans and treatment standards and things like that that actually address modern slavery beyond do you have a statement and have you signed our code of conduct. Any more for any more? Still got five minutes if anyone's got any last minute questions. Oh yeah, we've got one in the chat. Okay. Financial institutions are often focused on identifying and reporting modern slavery risks, but there can be unintended consequences for victims, such as loss of access to banking facilities. How can banks balance safeguarding financial crime obligations and victim support to achieve better outcomes for those being exploited? These are all really great questions. I'm so happy. This is a great question, and I really appreciate that financial services is really heavily regulated, and you've got a lot that you're balancing, and I can really appreciate that. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be able to bring it back to that safeguarding piece. I think that actually when it comes to this, I don't know which organisation you're working for, what type of financial institution you're working for, but I think the main point is making sure that you have the right training and processes in place for the right teams. So I know that sounds like quite a broad brush approach, but if you have, for example, client-facing teams who are going to be dealing with individuals who may suffer repercussions of exploitation or may require additional support, those teams are going to have a very different skill set to a team that is perhaps looking at corporate assurance for suppliers or downstream value chain. So I think actually tailoring that training and understanding to specific roles is going to be really important, because it also means that you've not got one representative in the whole organization responsible for dealing with everything that comes with modern slavery. It's a very big topic, and as Izzy very nicely demonstrated earlier, it does touch so much more of your organization than maybe you would think on first thought. I also think trying to build in ideas of victim-centered approach and trauma-informed care into policies like escalation and remediation, grievance, whistleblowing, speak up is also really important. Again, those will have strict regulations about how they need to operate, but is there space within that to prioritise victim needs and allow people that opportunity to choose where they maybe haven't been able to choose before? I am aware that we've got another question and not very much time, so I'm going to move on. As a financial services organisation, much of our value chain consists of professional services and financial services rather than traditional manufacturing or high-risk supply chains. How do organisations typically approach audits and assurance activities within this type of value chain? Great. So the first thing that I would do is really look to assess that risk across your value chain. So where is your risk sitting? If you've got a supply chain made up of predominantly professional services and finance, are there other areas where the risk is maybe not as prolific in terms of the number of suppliers, but is maybe still high risk in itself? So, for example, facilities management, cleaning, catering, any subcontracted third parties that are working under your organization's name, for example. The other thing that you can do, and this is all in line with standards of best practice as well, is looking at where you have the most leverage with your value chain as well, and prioritizing it that way. So recognizing where you have the most impact to make change and kind of using that as your focus area. It makes it much more manageable, and it also means that you're tailoring that due diligence where it needs to go. When it comes to audits and assurance activities, again, it will depend on your organisation and the systems you have set up to do this. I have some organisations where their approach is much more it's not audit focused, it's more desk based. So almost doing like know your customer visits, but with suppliers. So know your supplier visits, where you kind of get used to having conversations about modern slavery and exploitation. You allow them the opportunity to raise concerns with you, and you can respond in a way that is not off-putting and is also measured. Again, similar to the question I answered for Rebecca, having a sort of baseline set of questions that you can use to identify any potential areas of concern and building that into any ongoing management with that client. You can also start looking at what happens before you onboard clients, so your tender processes as well and your onboarding processes. How do you assess risk from that beginning stage? But if we're talking about assurance and audits, kind of taking that desk-based approach and having that set of questions that you can use through ongoing management is great. When it comes to audits, what we're seeing is this is mostly, in fact, almost entirely, to my knowledge, actually focused on high-risk sectors of the supply chain. So, for example, there are organisations that are doing big office refurbs, branch closures, data centre building, all of those types of things that obviously involve a lot of high-risk construction suppliers. So there's been a big focus on shifting due diligence and audits towards them. Facilities management is another area where we've seen this. However, we are also starting to see this move around how do we assure maybe some of our international suppliers as well. So if you've got call centres, tech centres, data centres elsewhere in the world, what does that process look like for them there? So I think really, to put that nice and succinctly, is really look at prioritizing. So assessing that risk, prioritizing your engagement, and identifying where you've got the most leverage and taking it from there, really. Hopefully that has answered all of your questions. Like I say, if you've got anything else or you aren't happy with your answer and you want to talk about it more, do feel free to reach out. I'm very happy to do so. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. It's been lovely to see you, or not see you. Engage with you, maybe, is the better term. And hopefully we will engage with each other again soon. Thank you very much, everyone.